This week on Empowering Midlife Wellness, I'm back with my partner, Dr. Leah, and we're talking about this amazing molecule, nitric oxide, and how it might be one of the keys to reducing chronic illness of all kinds. Hi friends, and welcome to this week's episode. I'm so glad to have my partner, Dr. Leah, back today. I know you love it when she's here with me. And today we're talking about this really amazing, naturally occurring substance called nitric oxide, and just how many chronic diseases are affected by it getting lower, not only as we get older, but by lifestyle changes.
Absolutely. So the whole reason that this kind of came up is Susan and I were on a Zoom call and she was drinking some concoction. We started talking about how we both had been obviously learning about this and had some experience in our own lives, and then, you know, how it relates to pretty much everything, because as a molecule that vasodilates, which means that it gets oxygen and nutrients and stem cells to our bodies, it is absolutely so vitally important to our repair and to prevention of disease.
Yeah, it's really interesting. The more we learn about the etiology or the cause of most chronic diseases, we can sort of summarize it into blood vessel disease. So if we're losing blood flow to our brain, that causes dementia, to our heart, that ultimately ends up in heart disease, to our other organs. So anything that improves blood flow is a good thing. So what is nitric oxide and how does it work?
So nitric oxide is just a molecule. It's just a nitrogen and an oxygen, but it has many effects. So like I was saying, it dilates blood vessels, which gets, blood, oxygen, nutrients, stem cells to our vessels, but it's also important at signaling. So it makes our brain do certain things. It helps the glucose transporter, the GLUT4 transporter, get glucose to our muscles and to where it needs. So that's very important. It's tied to, guess what? Insulin resistance. And it can help with muscle recovery, as you can imagine, again, by those same processes.
So it's really good when we have more nitric oxide, I think we all agree. And it's higher when we're young. It drops with age. But our lifestyle, particularly in the last few decades, has really increased this nitric oxide reduction. Several reasons, right? And that some of them you mentioned, partly what we're eating, because it's found in certain foods, and the nitric oxide that we're consuming isn't as much as it used to be. And then partly because it's produced in all of these interesting places. So I thought nitric oxide was only produced by the inside of our blood vessels, the endothelial cells, and it is, but it's also produced in other places.
Yeah, so basically that kind of brings us to my story. I had to have some dental work done, had to have a bunch of mouthwashes and and I was using all this stuff, which I hated because it burnt my mouth, and I saw my blood pressure going up, and I saw my gums becoming irritated, and that's how I started learning more about nitric oxide. So it's made in the lining of our cells, but it's also made back of our tongue, in our microbiome, in our mouth, in our sinuses, and it's even an immune system has its own separate nitric oxide production as well. So going back to what Susan alluded to with lifestyle, one of the most horrible things you might be doing is using mouthwash.
Yeah, really interesting. And I used to use mouthwash, but when we do so, and that ads suggests that it kills 99% of bacteria in our mouth, but just like in our gut, a lot of those bacteria are really necessary for health. So as you mentioned, this happened to you, and there are studies showing that people who use mouthwash have a higher incidence of high blood pressure, which is really fascinating, and then stopping it, blood pressure can be lowered because it kills those bacteria that produce nitric oxide. So really interesting. Toothpaste also.
Right. So the fluoride, and probably people have heard a lot about that and it being toxic and, ending up in your bones and things like that, possibly contributing to osteoporosis, but it also is killing the good bacteria in your mouth and being toxic to them, and then also destroying the stomach acid, which is really important. A lot of people think that stomach acid is the problem with their having reflux disease and things like that, and it's probably not your stomach acid, it's probably overproduction being spurred by different things like high fructose corn syrup and processed foods, and who knows, even stress or not sleeping enough. So fluoride can actually be detrimental. I switched to a fluoride-free toothpaste quite a while ago from learning all
it's
of
really
this.
interesting. So if we sort of start at the top, we've assessed and agreed that we need nitric oxide. We want it to be high. We know it goes down with age. So what can we do about it? So we want to not kill the bacteria that produce it in our mouth. So getting rid of mouthwash and using a non-fluoride toothpaste, that's great here. And then you alluded to something, so as we go down the trail in our stomach, anything that reduces stomach acid, and these drugs that many of us take, PPIs or proton pump inhibitors, Nexium, Prilosec, etc., can really harm the bacteria that produce nitric oxide in our stomach as well, right?
Absolutely. So, originally proton pump inhibitors and many drugs, antidepressants included, were meant to be short term, and they became over the counter, and so people are on them perpetually.
Right.
And unfortunately, that allows them to continue an unhealthy lifestyle, like eating late at night, which, I mean, who doesn't love ice cream at 9 p.m.? But long term, not only does that decrease your ability to absorb nutrients, it also increases the inflammatory reaction, because if you're not absorbing nutrients and breaking down foods, then all of a sudden it becomes absorbed and gets across the lining and recognized as foreign, which can create its own immune response, and that's problematic as well.
Okay, so mouth, we've dealt with. Stomach. What are some things we can do to enhance nitric oxide production? So we talked about, if you can not take a PPI, that's great. If you've already been on one for a long time, work with your doctor on how to maybe find another solution for your reflux or to gradually get off of it. You don't want to stop those cold turkey. There's some other things. There's some kind of interesting science developing in taking other forms of acid, like vinegar.
My favorite, apple cider vinegar.
Right. So we actually want to, it's just really interesting. I was sort of taught, and we had this idea, perhaps you do too, that stomach acid's bad and that we want to take antacids and all of these different ways to reduce stomach acid. But I talked last week about iron being preferentially absorbed in an acidic environment. So is magnesium, so is calcium, so is many things.
Zinc, selenium. Yeah.
Right, acid is what breaks down protein in our stomach, and so we need stomach acid. And then also on this topic of nitric oxide, without the acid, we produce less nitric oxide in our stomach. So then we might have multiple factors that are reducing this really critical molecule. So we want to work on those. And then what about stuff we're putting in our stomach? We talked briefly about foods and some of the weird stuff I eat, like lots of beets. So how do we get nitric oxide from food?
Well, there are green leafy vegetables, beets, things like that, and even things that help with some of the precursors. Some information out there about L-arginine and BH4. But other than green leafy vegetables and certain foods that can be high in nitric oxide, which is tricky because it turns out if your celery is grown in Dallas, you have more nitric oxide than you do in a state that has less sun. But even just breathing through your nose and humming can help increase the nitric oxide, because you have in your sinuses a layer of cells that will actually produce that as well. So I'm not saying go around humming all day. People might think you're a little weird, but having an ohm every once in a while is going to go a really long way.
One of the many reasons to do an ohm. So I love beets. I know some people don't. There's actually a product that I take. I'll show you a picture of it. Super Beets, if you want to get like a really high dose of nitrates, which turn into nitrites and then into nitric oxide. So if you like beets, I mix a spoonful of this and drink it every day. There's some science, granted not the most rigorous science, suggesting that products like Super Beets can improve athletic performance. There's some data in the cycling community about that. People like me who do triathlons take it for that reason. If that's true, it's again because of just blood vessel dilation. So you're getting more blood flow to your muscles. That sounds like a good thing if you're an athlete. So there's a lot of kind of emerging science around the different benefits this might have, not only for chronic disease, but just for improving your performance. Or like you mentioned earlier, getting rid of muscle pain or other things of that nature. So beets, other green leafy vegetables we talked about. And then what should we not eat?
So, that might be more important, right? So we talked about the fluoride and the mouthwash and things like that. And then y'all are going to be shocked, but sugar. Yeah. Sugar's a problem. It's a problem for the oral microbiome, for the gut, of course. Alcohol, it destroys many things, including the bacteria in your stomach, but it decreases nitric oxide production. Processed food in general, and anything that's inflammatory would be, things to avoid. So.
Yeah, so sugar's interesting. The more we learn about it, the less of it that I want to eat, unfortunately.
It becomes easier, the more I learn,
Yeah.
what it really, really does. It's just
sugar
whoa,
and alcohol keep coming up again and again.
They really
so sugar is
do.
really interesting in this setting, talking about nitric oxide, because we talked about sugar actually destroys the healthy bacteria that make nitric oxide. Having low nitric oxide increases our risk of diabetes. So it's kind of another fire that feeds itself. It makes it worse, and then it gets worse, and then it gets worse. And so to break that cycle, we just need to stop eating it. Yeah.
And then, of course, smoking anything. Anytime you inhale something that's hot and chemically, you're increasing inflammation in your body. So...
Yeah, so smoking, that sort of almost goes without saying, but smoking increases the risk of just about everything. So we can eat certain foods. It sounds like green leafy vegetables, beets, other things with nitrites, not eat sugar, increase the acid in our stomach, get rid of the toothpaste and the mouthwash. I mean, these are simple things.
Yeah.
And it's just sort of real science.
Yeah. Oh, and there's one more, and this is going to shock you, and the price tag is unbelievable. 20 minutes of walking outside in the morning sun.
Oh, sunshine.
Which is completely free.
Yeah, so interesting regarding sunshine, there's data about sunlight and the way it's absorbed through our skin and affects vitamin D production that increases nitric oxide as well. So it does sound a bit like a broken record to not eat sugar and go outside and eat healthy vegetables, but it helps so many things. So it's hard to measure nitric oxide because it's a gas. It disappears very quickly, so it's not a blood test that will accurately measure it. So how would somebody know if their nitric oxide was low? I guess we're really going to looking at the symptoms that are existing.
Well, a lot of people that have high blood pressure have definitely low nitric oxide by mechanisms we just explained. People with an elevated hemoglobin A1C also have low nitric oxide. In fact, there were some studies that said that if you're over 40, you can assume that it has age-related decrease as well, but also decreased exercise tolerance. So if suddenly you're just like, gosh, I can't do the same workout, or, all of a sudden you're winded going upstairs and things like that, that could be.
And these are all mechanisms of just getting less blood flow to the target organ. And another one that men see frequently is erectile dysfunction. So we can assume if you have ED that you've got less blood flow. Now, women have the same thing. We just can't see it quite as obviously, but often sexual dysfunction in men and women can be a sign of low nitric oxide. So anytime we're getting less blood flow, one of the reasons could be that we have a decrease in nitric oxide. So really fascinating, even though we can't measure it, if you have any of those symptoms, increasing your nitric oxide with the things that we talked about could help those symptoms to resolve, which is really amazing considering we used to throw a bunch of drugs at you.
Yes.
And many patients can actually not take blood pressure medication, but can instead do some of these other things like changing their diet, get rid of mouthwash, toothpaste, going outside in the sun, and can get off their blood pressure medication. Kind of amazing.
It is. It is amazing. It's amazing that this problem can be solved by avoiding certain things and then continuing to do some things which are, all practically free and have multiple health benefits. So it's actually really nice.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that can be mitigated with lifestyle without medication. Now, sometimes you might need medication, but these are just things that we offer to discuss with your doctor and see if they work, because who doesn't want to get off their drugs? I just read a thing today saying that showing that women over 65 take an average of 4 prescription medications. That's an average. Many take up to 10. Arguably, if we started this a little earlier with some of these interventions, we could avoid that altogether.
Yeah.
So the way I think we'll just talk about high blood pressure, because that's maybe the most common symptom that you might have if your nitric oxide is low. And it's something that we sort of take for granted, but now we're considering anything, we want our blood pressure to be under 120 on the top and 80 on the bottom.
Yeah, ladies, a lot of us really should be 110 over 70. I mean, a lot of those standards were, of course, done on male studies, and we're smaller. We should have a lower blood pressure, but...
So if you're going to the doctor and your blood pressure is sort of 140 over 90 and the doctor's saying it's fine, it's not. So if you think about what's happening inside the pipes that are your blood vessels, when the pressure's high inside that pipe, it's causing damage just like it would in your plumbing. And we don't want to damage the very fragile inside of our blood vessels. That's essentially what leads to all the things we don't want, like heart disease, dementia, Now, let's talk about that. There's some really interesting studies linking nitric oxide depletion to dementia, which I think is fascinating because that's probably the one thing that all of us don't want more than just about anything else.
Yeah, it looks like when we don't have enough nitric oxide, you can imagine, again, the vessels are narrowing, then it leads to protein misfolding down the line and those plaques and whatnot. So, I mean, you can just imagine that anytime you're not getting enough oxygen, and that can be disrupted sleep apnea, all kinds of issues or inflammation to vessels that you're not going to get nutrients, and then things are not going to go the right way over time. So it makes total sense. And it's also another reason that I love far infrared saunas, and infrared light is another way to increase nitric oxide and decrease blood pressure and increase healing and growth hormone at night and improve sleep as well. So for people who maybe can't always do cardio or go walk outside, or maybe you just can't do it that day or don't want to, that is absolutely an alternative as well.
So anything that decreases blood flow to your brain, and you mentioned some of them, like not sleeping, and that could be indirectly caused by alcohol, which is possibly why alcohol is associated with dementia, or high blood pressure, or diabetes, or any of these various ways that blood flow can be restricted to the brain. All of those increase the risk of dementia, so we want to improve blood flow to the brain and the heart and the kidneys and the liver and our muscles and every other part of our body. So it is really a fascinating and important idea to think about ways that we can increase this molecule in our bloodstream. So we talked about you can't draw your blood and check for it, so we're often just looking at symptoms that you might have to assume if it's low. And you mentioned we can just assume that it's low just because we're over 40. So how do we, other than eating more and doing those things, can you take a supplement to make it better?
There are some products out there that I haven't tried. Clearly, you have, that will increase the nitric oxide part, but it's more complicated than that. You also have to have the enzymes that are converting, and you have to have certain pre-substrates as well. So, yes, you could take something that might elevate your nitric oxide temporarily, but it also may not work at all.
Yeah, it's tricky. And I took a product, which is a very good product, and I was in that 1% that was allergic to it. So I broke out in hives all over, and I'm not suggesting that's common. These products are very good for most people, but there are, anytime we're taking any sort of supplement, that's a potential issue that we could have a reaction to it. So if we can cause our body to produce it ourselves, I mean, that's really ideal, rather than taking something from the outside world. But there are products that either have, as you mentioned, the substrates to make nitric oxide, or actually are nitric oxide themselves. Now, if you're taking a nitric oxide sublingual capsule, it's going to sort of bubble and fizz in your mouth because it's a gas. How much of that gets into your bloodstream, we have no idea. So it's an interesting idea. I tried it myself. But I do personally like the idea of trying to create it on our own.
For sure.
By not eating certain things, eating other things, and then employing those lifestyle changes. You know, one of the reasons is it not only improves nitric oxide, but it's good for everything else too.
Yeah, I mean, like beets, right? So
exercise.
Right. I mean, iron and fiber and, all of it. So, absolutely.
It's all of these interventions are going to have so many health benefits. So if you're exercising, not using mouthwash, not using fluoride toothpaste, not eating a lot of sugar, walking outside in the sun, using an infrared sauna, yes, your nitric oxide will go up, and a whole bunch of other things will improve as well.
Pretty simple.
I would do it all together. Now that I didn't try it. So eat lots of beets, and I'll share with you my favorite super beet product. Is actually quite good. I haven't decided if it's affected my exercise performance positively yet, but it's not bad for you, so you could give it a try. So what else do we have to say about this amazing molecule? It's pretty interesting, and these are things you are not taught in medical school, so we're really learning with you here.
I would just say, circling back to the erectile dysfunction for the ladies, like, granted, it's pretty simple. With men, it's pretty evident, but I think, again, you would be surprised. Like, people are like, oh, I just have decreased sensation, I'm aging, that's normal. Well, don't accept that, try boosting your nitric oxide naturally, and other health parameters too. It can be complicated. So just know that, hey, that might be related, or I have high blood pressure. Maybe that's contributing to some things. And I would personally give up the mouthwash for 2 weeks, take your blood pressure every day, and see what happens. Try some cloves instead.
Yeah, really interesting. So having a blood pressure cuff of your own is a really good idea. Blood pressure is a metric that is so highly related to so many different diseases. We really want that to be optimal. And as we were mentioning, this kind of blowing off of moderately elevated blood pressure really isn't a good idea. Even if it's a little bit high, and this happens all the time to us, where patients will come into our office and their blood pressure is really high, and perhaps they might say, oh, it just is only high in the doctor's office. Your body doesn't really care where you are. If it's high, it's high. And if it's high in the doctor's office, that suggests it's probably high anytime you're a little bit stressed. So don't blow that off. This white coat hypertension isn't a nothing. It means it's high. And if it's ever high, that's not good. So we really want to keep an eye on that.
Yeah, and every millimeter of mercury counts. It actually really, really does. So even if it's 125 for a long time instead of 110, that makes a difference for your longevity.
Honestly, if I could lower my blood pressure by exercising, walking in the sun, and eating beets instead of taking a drug for the rest of my life, and not using mouthwash, and you can, this is actually scientifically proven, what an amazing idea. Plus you'd have a whole bunch of other health benefits as well. It's always so great when you join us. So glad to have you here. I hope you learned something today. If you did, don't forget to subscribe, share it with your friends, and I can't wait to see you next week.